Security guards drag a black woman in handcuffs through the marble lobby of Manhattan's most prestigious bank, while employees film her humiliation on their phones. Dr. Amara Washington maintains perfect composure as racist whispers follow her every step, but her knowing smile suggests these people have no idea who they're really dealing with. What they don't know is that she owns everything they think they're protecting, and in 24 hours their world will come crashing down around them. The woman they're treated like a criminal built this institution from the ground up, and she's been playing the long game while they've been playing checkers. Every insult, every assumption, every moment of this degradation has been carefully documented by a legal team that's about to unleash the most explosive corporate scandal of the decade. What would you do if someone tried to steal what you built from the ground up? But what they don't know could destroy everything they think they own. 8 hours earlier, Amara Washington steps out of her black sedan onto the sidewalk outside Meridian Capital Bank, the morning sun casting long shadows across Manhattan's financial district. She adjusts her briefcase and checks her watch. 9:15 exactly, 15 minutes before her scheduled meeting with senior management. The building towers above her, 57 floors of glass and steel that she knows better than anyone should admit. Every floor plan, every security protocol, every hidden corner where real conversations happen, when the cameras aren't rolling. The lobby buzzes with the controlled chaos of a Monday morning, executives and assistants weaving between marble columns like players in an elaborate dance. Amara approaches the security desk, her Harvard MBA and 15 years at Goldman Sachs evident in every confident stride. The guard barely glances up from his newspaper before pointing toward a clipboard. "Visitor parking is around back," he mutters, assuming she couldn't possibly belong in the executive garage. She signs in as A. Washington, consultant, exactly as her appointment was scheduled, but notices how his eyes linger on her name with surprise. The elevator ride to the 47th floor gives her time to adjust her earpiece, a nearly invisible device that connects her to the legal team monitoring from a van parked across the street. Every word will be recorded, every microaggression documented, every assumption cataloged for the evidence file that's been building for 6 months. She built this bank from nothing 12 years ago, pouring her heart and her Harvard connections into creating something that would serve communities neglected by traditional banking. Now she's about to discover what it's become in her absence. Richard Blackstone waits in the executive conference room, his silver hair perfectly styled and his confidence radiating the particular arrogance of men who've never had their authority questioned. He checks his Rolex as she enters, his expression shifting from professional courtesy to barely concealed skepticism when he sees her face. "Ms. Washington, I presume?" His tone carries the weight of a man already convinced this meeting is a waste of his time. "I have to ask, are you sure you're in the right place? The Diversity and Inclusion Office is on the 32nd floor. Little do they know, every word is being recorded by the legal team she hired to document this moment. The conference room falls silent as Amara sets her briefcase on the polished mahogany table and removes a thick folder of documents. 3 other executives flank Blackstone: Jennifer Walsh from Human Resources, David Martinez from Operations, and Thomas Reed from Compliance. Their expressions range from curiosity to outright hostility. But Amara has faced worse rooms and walked away victorious. She opens with her credentials, laying out her MBA from Harvard Business School, her tenure at Goldman Sachs, and her specialization in organizational equity assessment. The words should command respect, but she watches their faces harden with each accomplishment. "Let me be frank, Ms. Washington," Blackstone interrupts, his voice dripping with condescension. "We agreed to this meeting as a courtesy to our board member who recommended you, but I'm not sure what a consultant like yourself could possibly tell us about running a bank that we don't already know." The pause before consultant carries enough venom to kill a small animal. "We've been successfully managing this institution for decades without outside interference." Amara maintains her professional composure while fury builds beneath the surface. She's sat in boardrooms from London to Tokyo, negotiated deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and never once has her competence been questioned so blatantly. But she has a job to do, evidence to gather, and a point to prove that will reshape this industry forever. She opens her folder and begins presenting data on workplace equity, citing specific federal regulations that govern fair hiring practices. As she speaks, she watches Blackstone's face for any sign of recognition, any hint that he remembers these same regulations from the bank's founding documents. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission requires financial institutions to maintain detailed records of hiring practices, she continues, her voice steady despite the growing tension in the room. Your current leadership demographics suggest potential compliance issues that could trigger federal investigation. The statement hangs in the air like a threat, which it is, though not in the way they think. Jennifer Walsh shifts uncomfortably in her chair, finally speaking up. Ms. Washington, I think you might be overstating the regulatory requirements. We maintain excellent compliance records. When she quotes the exact words from the bank's founding charter, Blackstone's face goes white, but not for the reason she expects. The tension in the room escalates when Amara produces documents that detail specific lending practices, numbers that should be confidential but somehow found their way into her briefcase. She cites rejection rates for minority-owned businesses, approval disparities for identical loan applications, and patterns that paint a picture of systematic discrimination. The evidence is damning, meticulously researched, and impossible to dismiss. But instead of addressing the substance of her presentation, Blackstone leans back in his chair with a cold smile that doesn't reach his eyes. I'm curious, Ms. Washington, he says, his voice taking on the dangerous quiet of a predator circling wounded prey. How exactly did you obtain internal bank data? That information is proprietary and protected by multiple confidentiality agreements. He stands slowly, his imposing frame casting a shadow across the conference table. In fact, I'm beginning to wonder if this entire meeting is some kind of corporate espionage disguised as consulting. The accusation hits the room like a physical blow, and Amara feels the atmosphere shift from professional skepticism to open hostility. Jennifer Walsh immediately reaches for her phone, her loyalty to Blackstone overriding any concern for due process or basic fairness. I'm calling security, she announces, her voice trembling with either excitement or fear. We can't allow potential industrial espionage to continue. David Martinez and Thomas Reed exchange glances, their discomfort obvious, but their courage insufficient to challenge the narrative being constructed around them. They've chosen their side, and it isn't justice. The security team arrives within minutes. Marcus Chen, the head of security, accompanied by two guards who look like they'd rather be anywhere else. Marcus hesitates at the threshold, something familiar about Amara nagging at the back of his mind, but Blackstone's authority overrides his instincts. Remove her, Blackstone commands, pointing at Amara as if she's contaminated the very air in the room. Search her belongings for any stolen materials and escort her from the building immediately. The next 30 minutes unfold like a nightmare orchestrated by bureaucratic sadism. Amara's briefcase is emptied onto the conference table, her personal items scattered like evidence at a crime scene. Her business cards, her laptop, her carefully prepared presentation materials, all examined and photographed as if they contain state secrets. Employees gather in the hallway outside the conference room, drawn by the commotion and the irresistible allure of witnessing someone else's destruction. Their phones emerge like weapons, recording her humiliation for social media consumption and water cooler entertainment. The handcuffs are the final insult, cold metal against her wrists that transforms her from a Harvard-generated professional into a common criminal in the eyes of everyone watching. Marcus Chen's hands shake slightly as he applies them, his instincts screaming that something is terribly wrong, but his training demanding compliance with executive orders. "Ma'am, I'm sorry," he whispers, As he leads her toward the elevator, the only person in the building who seems to recognize her humanity. As she's dragged away, she whispers something to Marcus that makes him freeze mid-step. The holding cell at the 23rd precinct smells like disinfectant and broken dreams. But Amara Washington has been in worse places and emerged victorious. She sits on the metal bench with perfect posture, her mind already 3 steps ahead of her captors, her heart steady with the knowledge that this humiliation is temporary, but the justice it will bring is permanent. The desk sergeant, a weary man with kind eyes, processes her paperwork with apologetic efficiency, clearly uncomfortable with arresting someone who looks more like his daughter's teacher than a corporate spy. When they offer her the traditional phone call, Amara doesn't dial a lawyer or a bail bondsman. Instead, she calls a number she memorized 6 months ago, one that connects directly to a secure line monitored by a team of legal professionals who have been waiting for this exact moment. "Phoenix," she says simply when the voice answers, and immediately she can hear the controlled excitement on the other end. Phase 2 begins now. Execute the media strategy and prepare the documentation. They took the bait perfectly. The conversation is brief but loaded with meaning that would terrify Blackstone if he could hear it. Phoenix team represents 6 months of planning, investigation, and preparation for this exact scenario. They have evidence files thick enough to choke a federal judge, media contacts at every major news outlet in the country, and legal arguments that will reshape employment law for generations. But more than that, they have the truth, and truth has a power that money and connections can't touch. As she waits for release, Amara allows herself to remember the journey that brought her to this moment. 12 years ago, she stood in an empty building in Manhattan's financial district, her Harvard MBA still fresh, her dreams of ethical banking still untainted by reality. She had vision, determination, and enough family money to make those dreams reality. Meridian Capital Bank was born from her desire to serve communities that traditional banks ignored, to prove that profit and principle could coexist in the world of high finance. The early years were golden, filled with success stories and community impact that made every 18-hour day worth the sacrifice. Small businesses flourished with her loans, families achieved homeownership through her programs, and the bank's reputation grew as a beacon of responsible lending. But success brought growth, and growth brought outside investors who valued profit over principle. Slowly, subtly, the institution she built began to change, and she found herself increasingly marginalized by the very board she had assembled. 6 months ago, an anonymous complaint reached her through channels she had established for exactly this purpose. An employee reported systematic discrimination, hostile work environment, and leadership that actively discouraged diversity in hiring and promotion. The complaint was detailed, specific, and heartbreaking in its familiarity. She had heard these stories before, from other companies, other industries, other victims of institutional prejudice. But this time, it was happening in the company she built with her own hands. Outside the police station, 3 black SUVs pull up as Phoenix team initiates Phase 2. The executive bar at the Meridian Club overflows with expensive whiskey and cheaper morality as Richard Blackstone holds court among his closest allies. The mahogany paneling and leather chairs provide the perfect backdrop for celebration, the kind of old money atmosphere that makes men like Blackstone feel invincible. He raises his crystal tumbler in a toast, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a hunter who has bagged his trophy. "Gentlemen, today we removed a cancer from our organization before it could metastasize. That woman was clearly sent by our competitors to steal proprietary information and create negative publicity." Jennifer Walsh nervously sips her wine, her earlier excitement fading as the reality of their actions settles in. "Richard, I keep thinking about the legal implications. What if she files a discrimination lawsuit? The optics of arresting a black consultant during a business meeting?" Her voice trails off as Blackstone's expression darkens with irritation. She knows better than to challenge his judgment when he's riding high on perceived victory. Jennifer, you worry too much, Blackstone dismisses with a wave of his hand. We have documentation of her suspicious behavior, evidence of potential espionage, and witness testimony from multiple executives. No court in the country would side with someone who violated our security protocols. He takes another drink, his confidence growing with each sip. Besides, people like her always overplay their hand. They think they can walk into our world and demand respect they haven't earned. David Martinez and Thomas Reed nod along, their silence complicit in the narrative being constructed around them. They review the security footage on Martinez's tablet, pointing and laughing at moments from Amara's humiliation like spectators at a gladiator match. The recording shows her maintaining dignity even in handcuffs, but they see only what they want to see. A threat neutralized, an outsider expelled, their world restored to its proper order. Unknown to them, Jake Rodriguez sits at his desk 3 floors below, his fingers flying across his keyboard as he uploads every piece of digital evidence to secure servers monitored by Phoenix team. Jake has been Amara's inside contact for months, hired as an IT specialist but actually serving as her eyes and ears within the company. His job tonight is crucial, capturing and preserving every conversation, every email, every digital footprint that will form the foundation of tomorrow's reckoning. The bar's atmosphere grows more toxic with each round of drinks, inhibitions lowering and true feelings emerging like sewage backing up through expensive plumbing. Blackstone's comments become increasingly racist, his language more crude, his assumption of immunity more complete. He speaks about those people with the casual cruelty of someone who has never faced consequences for his prejudice, never been held accountable for the damage his words cause. His celebration is interrupted by an urgent call from the bank's board of directors. Marcus Chen cannot shake the feeling that he has made a terrible mistake. The head of security sits in his office, reviewing surveillance footage from the afternoon's incident, rewinding and replaying the moments when Amara Washington was removed from the building. Something about her calm demeanor, her knowing smile, the way she carried herself even in handcuffs. It all feels wrong in ways his trained instincts cannot ignore. 20 years in law enforcement taught him to read people, and every fiber of his being screams that this woman was not a threat. He begins digging deeper into the visitor logs, cross-referencing Amara's name with building access records. What he discovers makes his blood pressure spike and his hands shake. A Washington consultant has been visiting the building regularly for 6 months, always with proper authorization, always meeting with legitimate bank personnel. Her access card was issued by the board of directors themselves, signed and approved at the highest levels of corporate authority. The consulting contract makes Marcus's throat dry with recognition. The signature belongs to Harold Morrison, the chairman of the board and one of the bank's founding members. The scope of work explicitly authorizes comprehensive organizational assessment, including review of personnel files, lending practices, and compliance procedures. Everything Amara Washington discussed in that conference room was not only legitimate but specifically requested by the bank's own leadership. Marcus tries calling Blackstone immediately, but the call goes to voicemail. He tries Jennifer Walsh, David Martinez, anyone who participated in this afternoon's debacle, but none of them answer their phones. They're probably celebrating at some expensive restaurant, toasting their victory while the evidence of their catastrophic error mounts on his desk like an avalanche of legal liability. The deeper Marcus digs, the more horrifying the picture becomes. Amara Washington isn't just any consultant. She's specifically mentioned in board minutes as conducting a comprehensive review of workplace culture and compliance procedures. Her authority comes directly from the top, her access approved by people with more power than Blackstone could ever dream of possessing. The woman they arrested and humiliated has backing that reaches into the highest levels of corporate governance. But the most disturbing discovery comes when Marcus accesses the building's historical records, diving back through years of security footage and access logs. A face keeps appearing, always in the company of Harold Morrison, always treated with the deference reserved for people of extraordinary importance. The face is older, the hair different, but the eyes are unmistakable. The woman they dragged away in handcuffs has been coming to this building for over a decade, treated like royalty by people who know secrets Marcus can only guess at. When he pulls up the consulting contract details, the signature line makes his blood run cold. The first news van arrives at Meridian Capital Bank just as the evening shift begins, followed quickly by reporters from local television stations who received anonymous tips about a dramatic arrest in the financial district. The footage of Amara Washington's removal has already gone viral on social media, shared thousands of times with hashtags like banking while black and corporate racism. The optics are devastating. A professional black woman in handcuffs being dragged through a marble lobby while employees film her humiliation. Richard Blackstone receives the call from the bank's public relations department while he's finishing his third whiskey at the Meridian Club. The words hit him like ice water. Media attention, viral video, stock price concerns, and emergency board meetings scheduled for tomorrow morning. His celebration dies in his throat as he realizes the scope of the problem. What felt like a surgical strike against a potential threat has turned into a public relations nightmare, with tentacles reaching into every aspect of the bank's operations. Jennifer Walsh's phone buzzes constantly with calls from reporters, legal analysts, and advocacy groups demanding statements about the bank's hiring practices and treatment of minority consultants. She tries reaching the bank's legal department, but they're not returning calls, a silence that speaks volumes about their assessment of the situation. The attorneys who usually provide cover for executive decisions have apparently decided this fire is too hot to touch. The bank's stock price begins dropping in aftermounts trading as investors digest the viral footage and its implications. Major clients start making discreet inquiries about their accounts, uncomfortable with being associated with an institution that appears to engage in blatant discrimination. The financial damage spreads like a virus through electronic trading systems, each percentage point representing millions of dollars in lost market value. Social media amplifies the story with righteous fury, turning Amara Washington into a symbol of systemic racism in corporate America. The hashtags trend nationally within hours, accompanied by calls for boycotts, federal investigation, and criminal charges against bank leadership. What started as an internal personnel matter has exploded into a national conversation about power, privilege, and accountability in American business. Emergency meetings convene throughout the evening as various bank departments try to assess the damage and develop response strategies. But every conversation hits the same wall. Nobody can explain why a properly authorized consultant with legitimate business was treated like a common criminal. The optics are indefensible, the legal exposure enormous, and the financial consequences mounting by the hour. But nothing could prepare them for who walks into tomorrow's emergency board meeting. The boardroom fills with tension thick enough to cut as directors file into their leather chairs, their faces grave with the weight of a crisis none of them saw coming. Harold Morrison, the distinguished chairman with silver hair and kind eyes, calls the meeting to order at exactly 8 o'clock. His usual warmth replaced by steely determination. Richard Blackstone enters with false confidence, his prepared remarks about protecting corporate security dying in his throat when he sees who sits at the far end of the table. Amara Washington rises from her chair with fluid grace, no longer the humiliated woman from yesterday's footage, but transformed into something far more dangerous, herself. Gone are the conservative consultant clothes, replaced by a power suit that costs more than most people's cars. Her hair flows freely now, no longer constrained by the professional styling that disguised her true identity. Behind her stand 5 attorneys who look like they could argue constitutional law before the Supreme Court and win. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harold Morrison begins, his voice carrying the authority of someone who has commanded boardrooms for 40 years. "I would like to formally introduce Dr. Amara Washington, founder and majority shareholder of Meridian Capital Bank, returning from her extended research sabbatical to address some concerning issues that have come to our attention. The words land like grenades in the silent room, exploding assumptions and reshaping reality in real time. Blackstone's face cycles through disbelief, horror, and panic as the implications crash over him like tsunami waves. He tries to speak, to protest, to maintain some shred of the authority he wielded just 24 hours ago, but Harold Morrison continues with relentless precision. Dr. Washington founded this institution 12 years ago with a vision of ethical banking and community service. Her Harvard MBA and 15 years at Goldman Sachs qualified her to build something special in the financial industry. The evidence wall comes down like Judgment Day, overwhelming in its scope and devastating in its detail. Amara activates a large screen that displays months of documentation, audio recordings of Blackstone's racist comments from yesterday's celebration, email chains discussing strategies to limit minority hiring, lending data showing systematic discrimination against businesses owned by people of color. Each piece of evidence carries timestamps, witness statements, and legal annotations that transform isolated incidents into patterns of institutional bias. For 6 months, Amara's voice cuts through the stunned silence. I have been conducting an undercover assessment of this institution's culture and practices. What I discovered broke my heart and violated every principle upon which this bank was founded. Her words carry both professional authority and personal pain, the unique perspective of someone watching their creation become corrupted by the very prejudices it was designed to combat. The legal team presents federal compliance violations, documentation of hostile work environment, and evidence of discriminatory practices that violate multiple civil rights statutes. Each revelation builds upon the last, creating an avalanche of liability that threatens not just individual careers but the institution's very survival. The scope of the investigation astounds even seasoned directors who thought they understood the extent of their problem. Jennifer Walsh begins hyperventilating as she realizes her complicity in discriminating against the bank's own founder. David Martinez and Thomas Reed sit in stunned silence, their faces pale as they comprehend the magnitude of their error. But Richard Blackstone's world collapses completely when Amara produces the termination paperwork, signed and dated, removing him from all positions within the company, effective immediately. Now, she says, pulling out termination papers, let's discuss your future employment prospects. Have you ever had to bite your tongue when you held all the power? Drop a fire emoji if you're ready to see justice served. The termination of Richard Blackstone unfolds with surgical precision, each severance benefit stripped away as legal justification mounts. His pension forfeited due to termination for cause involving civil rights violations. His stock options voided under ethics clauses he never bothered to read carefully. His consulting agreements and board positions canceled immediately as word spreads through Manhattan's financial community about his involvement in one of the year's most explosive discrimination cases. 27 years of accumulated benefits disappear in a single morning, the corporate equivalent of complete annihilation. Jennifer Walsh's suspension, pending investigation, becomes a formality when recordings surface of her eager participation in Amara's humiliation. The human resources director, who should have protected employees from discrimination, instead enabled it, participating enthusiastically in the very behaviors her department was designed to prevent. Her professional reputation crumbles under the weight of evidence showing consistent bias in hiring decisions, performance evaluations, and disciplinary actions that disproportionately targeted minority employees. The legal machinery Phoenix team prepared for 6 months begins grinding through the federal system with unstoppable momentum. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission receives a complaint, supported by hundreds of pages of evidence, triggering an investigation that will examine every hiring decision, promotion, and termination for the past 5 years. The Department of Justice opens a preliminary review of potential civil rights violations, while state banking regulators initiate their own inquiries into discriminatory lending practices. Federal prosecutors show particular interest in Blackstone's attempt to have Amara arrested on false charges, viewing it as potential criminal conspiracy to violate civil rights under color of authority. The recordings of his racist comments, combined with his abuse of security procedures, create a compelling case for criminal prosecution that could result in significant prison time. Legal experts across the country began citing the case as a landmark example of individual accountability for institutional discrimination. The media strategy Amara's team developed unfolds like a masterclass in crisis communication. But this time, the crisis belongs to her opponents. Coordinated interviews with national news outlets tell the story of systematic investigation, documented evidence, and corporate accountability. The narrative focuses not on personal revenge, but on institutional reform, positioning Amara as a reluctant whistleblower forced to expose corruption in her own company. Major news networks pick up the story as representative of broader issues in American corporate culture, interviewing experts about unconscious bias, institutional racism, and the courage required to challenge entrenched power structures. The coverage frames Amara's investigation as a model for other companies, demonstrating how leadership can proactively address discrimination rather than waiting for external pressure or federal investigation. The financial impact ripples through the banking industry like an earthquake, initially causing Meridian Capital's stock to plummet before recovering, as investors recognize the strength of new leadership committed to genuine reform. Institutional investors actually increase their positions, viewing the bank's transparency and accountability as competitive advantages in an industry plagued by public relations disasters and regulatory scrutiny. Employee reactions range from shame among those who participated in or enabled discrimination to relief among those who suffered in silence. The anonymous employee whose original complaint triggered Amara's investigation emerges from the shadows, identified as Maria Santos, a loan officer whose attempts to serve minority clients were consistently blocked by supervisory staff. Her courage in reporting institutional bias becomes the catalyst for industry-wide reform. Support groups form organically among bank employees, creating safe spaces for discussing experiences with workplace discrimination and developing strategies for cultural change. The conversations reveal patterns of bias that extend far beyond individual incidents, exposing systematic exclusion from networking opportunities, professional development programs, and advancement pathways that shaped careers and limited potential for years. The personal cost to Amara becomes evident in quiet moments between media interviews and legal depositions. Building an institution from scratch, only to discover its corruption by the very biases she fought against, represents a unique form of betrayal that cuts deeper than professional disappointment. Her trust in systems, processes, and people has been fundamentally shaken, requiring emotional recovery alongside institutional reform. But the investigation also reveals unexpected allies within the company. Employees who documented discriminatory incidents, managers who quietly advocated for minority advancement, and board members who suspected problems but lacked evidence to address them effectively. These discoveries provide hope that change is possible when good people are empowered with proper tools and leadership support. The bank's internal policies undergo comprehensive revision with new procedures for reporting bias, investigating complaints, and ensuring accountability at every level of the organization. External consultants, specializing in workplace equity, develop training programs that go beyond legal compliance to address unconscious bias, cultural competency, and inclusive leadership practices that benefit all employees. But Blackstone has one final card to play that could derail everything. Richard Blackstone's last desperate gambit unfolds in a Manhattan courtroom where marble columns and mahogany paneling cannot disguise the stench of a legal strategy built on quicksand. His attorney, Marcus Rothwell, from the white shoe firm of Rothwell Pierce & Associates, attempts to paint their client as the victim of an elaborate entrapment scheme designed to destroy his reputation and career. The argument requires Olympic-level mental gymnastics, claiming that Amara Washington violated privacy laws by investigating her own company, invaded corporate security by accessing her own building, and committed fraud by using her real name while conducting authorized business. The legal proceedings become a masterclass in how privilege cannot overcome evidence when that evidence is overwhelming and meticulously documented. Rothwell tries every angle, claiming the recordings were illegally obtained despite their capture in public areas, arguing that Amara's undercover status invalidated any evidence despite her legitimate authority, and suggesting that discriminatory comments were taken out of context despite their crystal-clear meaning. Each argument crumbles under judicial scrutiny like sandcastles hit by tsunami waves. The cross-examination reveals patterns of discrimination that extend far beyond Meridian Capital Bank, painting a picture of Blackstone's entire career built on exclusion and bias. Former colleagues from previous positions testify about his consistent hostility toward minority employees, his role in blocking diverse hiring initiatives, and his history of creating hostile work environments wherever his influence extended. Character witnesses intended to support him instead reveal additional victims, expanding the case beyond a single incident to a comprehensive pattern of civil rights violations. Federal prosecutors present evidence that transforms workplace discrimination from a civil matter into criminal conspiracy charges. The attempt to have Amara arrested on fabricated charges, combined with his systematic exclusion of minority employees and clients, meets the legal definition of civil rights violations committed under color of authority. The prospect of federal prison time hangs over Blackstone like storm clouds, darkening every aspect of his defense strategy. His wife, Margaret Blackstone, sits in the gallery, watching 30 years of marriage dissolve under the weight of public humiliation and financial ruin. Their children, both adults with careers in finance, distance themselves from their father's scandal as employers and clients begin questioning their own associations with the family name. The social isolation cuts deeper than financial loss, transforming a man accustomed to respect and deference into a pariah, avoided by former friends and colleagues. The judge's ruling establishes legal precedent that validates undercover investigation methods when conducted by legitimate corporate authorities addressing discrimination complaints. The decision recognizes Amara's right to investigate her own company using whatever methods necessary to uncover illegal bias, creating jurisprudence that will protect other executives who choose similar approaches to institutional reform. Criminal charges followed the civil ruling, with federal prosecutors filing conspiracy charges that could result in up to 10 years in prison if convicted. The indictment alleges systematic civil rights violations, abuse of corporate authority, and conspiracy to deprive citizens of their constitutional rights under color of law. Legal experts consider the charges both appropriate and unprecedented, representing a new willingness to hold individual executives criminally accountable for institutional discrimination. Blackstone's professional destruction becomes complete when banking regulators permanently bar him from working in financial services, a lifetime prohibition that extends to consulting, advising, or holding fiduciary responsibility in any capacity. The regulatory action ensures that his influence over other people's financial futures ends forever, protecting potential victims from someone whose bias repeatedly harmed individuals and communities. 6 months later, the banking industry would never be the same. The Meridian Capital case becomes required reading at Harvard Business School, where Dr. Amara Washington's investigation methods are studied as a master class in ethical leadership and institutional accountability. Professor Elizabeth Chen assigns the case to her graduate students with a simple question: how do you reform systems that benefit from their own dysfunction? The resulting discussions challenge future business leaders to consider their responsibility for creating inclusive environments rather than merely avoiding obvious discrimination. Federal regulators respond to the case by implementing mandatory leadership authenticity audits for financial institutions with assets exceeding $50 billion. The new requirements force banks to demonstrate genuine commitment to diversity through measurable outcomes rather than symbolic gestures, creating accountability mechanisms that make discrimination financially unsustainable. Institutions must now prove their leadership development programs produce diverse advancement or face regulatory consequences that affect their ability to operate. The ripple effects spread through corporate America as other companies implement similar undercover assessment programs, recognizing that authentic cultural change requires honest diagnosis of existing problems. Chief executives across industries authorize comprehensive bias audits, understanding that the cost of investigation pales beside the potential liability of continued discrimination. The Meridian model becomes the gold standard for proactive corporate accountability. Banking regulation undergoes comprehensive overhaul as lawmakers recognize that individual accountability must accompany institutional reform. New legislation creates personal liability for executives who enable discrimination, removing the corporate shield that previously protected individual decision-makers from consequences of their biased actions. The laws establish criminal penalties for systematic civil rights violations committed under corporate authority. 3 other major financial institutions remove senior executives following similar investigations, proving that Meridian Capital represents broader industry problems rather than isolated incidents. The terminations send shockwaves through executive suites nationwide as leaders realize their careers depend on creating genuinely inclusive environments rather than maintaining comfortable status quo arrangements that exclude qualified minority candidates. Meridian Capital itself transforms into a model institution for authentic workplace equality, implementing mentorship programs that pair senior executives with high-potential minority employees, creating advancement pathways that bypass traditional networking barriers, and establishing accountability metrics that tie executive compensation to diversity outcomes. The changes produce measurable results within months as promotion rates for minority employees reach parity with overall advancement statistics. The bank's community investment focus returns to its original mission, with renewed emphasis on serving underbanked populations and supporting minority-owned businesses, previously excluded from traditional lending programs. Loan approval rates for qualified minority applicants increase dramatically as discriminatory practices are eliminated and replaced with objective assessment criteria that focus on credit worthiness rather than cultural assumptions. Industry observers note fundamental shifts in corporate culture as companies realize that diversity represents competitive advantage rather than regulatory burden. Organizations with inclusive leadership teams demonstrate superior financial performance, customer satisfaction, and employee retention rates compared to homogeneous counterparts. The business case for authentic diversity becomes undeniable when measured against objective performance metrics. But for Amara personally, the hardest work still lay ahead. 1 year later, Dr. Amara Washington stands in her corner office on the 57th floor of Meridian Capital Bank, watching the sunrise paint Manhattan's skyline in shades of gold and possibility. The view hasn't changed, but everything else has transformed beyond recognition. The executive suite buzzes with diverse voices discussing innovative lending programs, community investment opportunities, and breakthrough partnerships with minority-owned businesses. The energy feels different now. Authentic, purposeful, aligned with the vision she originally held when she built this institution from nothing more than Harvard connections and fierce determination. The leadership team reflects the community they serve, with executives who understand struggle because they've lived it, who recognize opportunity because they've been denied it, and who appreciate inclusion because they remember exclusion. Maria Santos, the loan officer whose courage triggered this entire investigation, now serves as Director of Community Outreach, ensuring that banking services reach populations traditionally ignored by financial institutions. Her promotion represents more than individual advancement. It demonstrates institutional commitment to elevating voices previously silenced by systematic bias. The personal journey from idealistic founder to disillusioned observer to empowered change agent, taught Amara lessons about power that no business school could provide. She learned that building institutions requires more than vision and capital. It demands constant vigilance against the human tendency to exclude, to other, to create barriers that preserve privilege at the expense of progress. The betrayal she felt, discovering discrimination in her own company, cut deeper than professional disappointment, challenging her faith in systems, processes, and people she trusted to preserve her values. But the investigation also revealed unexpected reserves of courage among employees who documented bias, managers who quietly advocated for minority advancement, and board members who suspected problems but lacked evidence to address them effectively. These discoveries restored her faith in human decency while reinforcing the importance of creating structures that empower good people to do the right thing when confronted with institutional pressure to conform to discriminatory norms. The bank's new policies extend far beyond legal compliance to address unconscious bias, cultural competency, and inclusive leadership practices that benefit all employees, regardless of background. Monthly bias training sessions, mentorship programs pairing senior executives with diverse junior staff, and advancement metrics tied to diversity outcomes create accountability mechanisms that make discrimination both detectable and costly. The changes produce measurable results that satisfy both moral imperatives and business objectives. Regular meetings with community leaders ensure that banking services evolve to meet changing needs rather than preserving outdated assumptions about creditworthiness and risk assessment. The conversations challenged traditional lending practices, revealing how cultural bias masqueraded as financial prudence and excluded qualified borrowers based on zip codes, names, and appearance rather than actual ability to repay loans. The quiet satisfaction Amara feels watching diverse teams collaborate on innovative solutions represents vindication of her original vision, combined with hard-earned wisdom about implementation challenges. She built this institution to serve communities neglected by traditional banking, but she learned that good intentions require constant reinforcement through policies, procedures, and personnel decisions that align actions with aspirations. Recognition from industry organizations and government agencies validates the transformation, but the real measure of success appears in community impact statistics. Increased lending to minority-owned businesses, expanded access to homeownership programs, and financial literacy initiatives that empower previously underserved populations. The numbers tell stories of dreams realized, opportunities created, and barriers removed through institutional commitment to authentic inclusion. True leadership isn't about the power you hold. It's about the courage to confront the systems that abuse that power, even when those systems benefit you. The transformation of Meridian Capital Bank represents more than corporate redemption. It demonstrates what becomes possible when leaders choose courage over comfort, authenticity over appearance, and systematic change over symbolic gestures. Dr. Amara Washington's investigation methods are being replicated across industries as executives recognize that true cultural assessment requires honest examination of existing practices rather than comfortable assumptions about organizational health. Her example proves that meaningful change requires leaders willing to risk their own positions to protect the principles they claim to represent. The statistics surrounding workplace discrimination reveal the scope of challenges facing American businesses, but they also highlight opportunities for competitive advantage through authentic inclusion. Companies with diverse leadership teams consistently outperform homogeneous counterparts in financial metrics, customer satisfaction, and employee retention rates. The business case for inclusion becomes undeniable when measured against objective performance standards, rather than subjective comfort levels that preserve existing power structures. Individual courage multiplies impact when channeled through institutional change, creating ripple effects that extend far beyond single organizations or industries. Every person who speaks up about bias, documents discrimination, or challenges exclusionary practices contributes to cultural transformation that benefits entire communities. The cumulative effect of individual actions creates social momentum that makes systematic change both inevitable and sustainable. Organizations across the country are implementing similar undercover assessment programs, recognizing that surface-level compliance with diversity requirements fails to address deeper cultural issues that limit opportunity and potential. The Meridian model provides a framework for authentic evaluation that produces actionable intelligence about institutional bias, while creating accountability mechanisms that ensure lasting reform rather than temporary publicity initiatives. The upcoming documentary series, Undercover CEO: Inside Corporate America, will examine similar investigations conducted by executives who discovered discrimination within their own organizations. Each episode reveals different methods, challenges, and outcomes, while highlighting common themes about power, privilege, and the courage required to challenge entrenched systems that benefit some at the expense of others. The series premieres next month with exclusive interviews and behind-the-scenes footage from multiple corporate investigations. Viewers can take immediate action by examining their own workplaces for signs of bias, supporting businesses with authentic diversity commitments, and holding their employers accountable for creating inclusive environments that value all employees. Simple steps like documenting discriminatory incidents, advocating for minority colleagues, and questioning hiring practices that consistently exclude qualified candidates contribute to cultural change that transforms entire industries over time. The legal precedents established through the Meridian case provide tools for other victims of workplace discrimination, creating pathways for accountability that previously seemed impossible. Federal prosecutors are increasingly willing to pursue criminal charges for systematic civil rights violations, while regulatory agencies implement oversight mechanisms that make institutional bias financially unsustainable for organizations that fail to reform. Should more CEOs go undercover in their own companies? Tell us your thoughts below. Power hidden is justice delayed. Power revealed is change unleashed.